Good morning, good afternoon, and or good evening. You're watching Nub's Collection, a YouTube series dedicated to the cataloging and review of every game of my physical media collection, and I really do mean every game of my physical media collection. As always, I am your host, Victory Nub, and today we are looking at our first Game Gear game. Specifically, we're looking at Sonic the Hedgehog 2, developed by Aspect, published by Sega, and released in the United States in December of 1992. So thanks to the power of backwards compatibility, my Retron 5 that I've been using for ages now to look at all the older games in my collection has an adapter that allows you to play Master System, Sega Card, and Game Gear games all in one little unit that you plug into the Sega Genesis slot. We will be able to look at the Game Gear games that I have. I don't have a ton of them. I only have 11 in total, of which we'll be able to make probably 8 or so episodes, and I'll spread them throughout the series of Nub's Collection episodes. They won't all be in one big group, so you don't have to worry about some dud episodes. And frankly, because it's a handheld game system, some of the games that came out on it were frankly really bad. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it. If you're talking about a handheld system, you're talking about probably some pretty lackluster video games. Sonic 2, I don't think is necessarily going to fall in the bad video game category. I just don't think it's quite the same quality as the console version of the Sonic games, but we'll go over that when we get to the end of the episode, when I do the stuff I usually do with Nub's Collection, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and give it a score. I did decide that I was going to do the audio commentary for this one in post. As much fun as I'm sure it normally is to hear me whine and moan about how difficult a game is, I thought maybe it would be a better idea to go over some fun facts about the Sega Game Gear. Since we're not going to be seeing a whole lot of games for the handheld, I thought now would probably be a good time to just kind of go over some of the details about the system, and just some fun facts about it that probably not a lot of people are aware of. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I am reading from some notes that I wrote beforehand, so this isn't all coming off of memory, but I think some of this stuff I actually did know before I decided to come up with the notes for it. The Game Gear was, of course, a Sega-produced handheld for the majority of its lifespan, and we'll go into more on that later. It was developed under the code name Project Mercury and was initially released in the United States in April of 1991. The handheld's central processing unit is an 8-bit 3.5 megahertz Zilog Z80, I think it's pronounced Zilog, it might be Zilog, which was originally launched in March of 1976. Now, that is about a 15-year span between the time that the processor was originally created and the time it was used in this handheld, which sounds like an awful long time for a computer processor to be used in anything, especially a gaming handheld. But it turns out that the Z80 was the same CPU used in the Sega Master System, and it acted as a sound processor for the Sega Genesis, as well as providing backwards compatibility on the Genesis for Sega Master System games. So it did get quite a good chunk of use by Sega for the length of time that they decided to use it. And in fact, the Z80 was actually used, I believe, in part with the construction of the original Game Boy. So it was a fairly powerful processor, and a lot of people found use out of it. The Game Gear sported a 3.2-inch backlit screen with a whopping 4,096 color palette, capable of producing 32 colors on screen at one time. Now, by modern standards, that doesn't sound all that impressive, but the truly impressive part about this is the fact that the available color palette is actually larger than not only the Sega Master System, which obviously came out 5 or 6 years before that, and only had available palette of 64 colors. It also had a larger palette than the Sega Genesis, which had a maximum palette of 512 colors. And just for comparison's sake, the original Game Boy, if you weren't familiar, had a 1.9-inch screen that was not backlit and displayed a whopping 4 colors at a time. And that was the max it had. And those colors were, if you're not familiar, light green, slightly light less green, green gray, and olive green. Future versions of the Handheld obviously went for more of a true gray background for the screen, and then eventually it did get a color palette that was comparable to the Super Nintendo's, which had roughly 32,000 capable, and quite a few available on screen at one time. The total palette doesn't represent how many you can actually use at any one time on most of these early consoles. It was usually a fairly small number. The handhelds had a single external mono speaker, just like the Game Boy, and in the case of the Game Gear, it was powered by a Texas Instrument SN76489 PSG, or programmable sound generator. Like most sound generators on early consoles, the way it usually worked is you would be able to produce what were called 3 square wave sounds and 1 triangle wave sound at the same time. That was how it worked on the regular Nintendo, the NES. And it turns out that this was the same sound processor found in both the Sega Master System and the Sega Genesis. So Sega was a really big fan of reusing processors in all of their equipment, at least in the first couple of generations of their consoles. Unlike the Master System, however, the Game Gear is capable of producing stereo sound through the use of headphones. Did I know this when I originally had the Game Gear? No, I don't think I ever actually plugged it in with the headphones. If I did anything, I just listened to the little external speaker. The Game Gear required a whopping 6 AA batteries to operate, and due to the enhanced graphical processing power and especially the backlit screen, it was an absolute battery hog. Average playtime for all 6 batteries was about 3 to 5 hours. Not a lot. By comparison, the Game Boy required only 4 AA batteries to operate, at least the original model, and they lasted about 15 hours on average, so 3 times as much playtime for fewer batteries. Now, future versions, I believe the Game Boy Pocket only required 2 AA batteries, and it ran almost as long, if not longer, than the original Game Boy. So obviously that was a big plus for the Game Boy, as if it needed more pluses for it. Trust me, this was a juggernaut that is still hard to compare any other idea of a handheld as far as sales, just the foothold in the landscape of video games that the Game Boy had. And obviously, while I had a Game Gear, yeah, the quality of the available games, the breadth of them, it's just not comparable. The Game Boy just blew the Game Gear out of the water. The introductory price of the Handheld was $149.99, which was almost double the cost of the original price for the Nintendo Game Boy at $89.99. Probably because of the extra processing power. I don't know. Maybe Sega was just trying to recoup costs because it was expensive to make. 365 games in total were released for the Game Gear. However, because of Nintendo's stranglehold on the developer market through their extremely restrictive licensing deals, a majority of Game Gear games were developed and published by Sega themselves. Aspect, I don't believe, actually was owned by Sega. However, they did produce a very large number of the games that came out on the Game Gear. They actually acted as kind of like a side... kind of like Insomniac, before I think Sony outright bought them, was a kind of a second-party developer for Sony, where technically Sony didn't own Insomniac, but the only company they ever made games for was Sony. Aspect was kind of like a second party for Sega. While they didn't actually work exclusively for Sega, the overwhelming majority of what they did was for Sega's various consoles and this handheld. Because of the shared processor components and the appropriately shaped screen, which had a 4:3 ratio in landscape orientation, a large number of games on the Game Gear were actually ported from the Sega Master System. The best-selling game for the Game Gear was, rather unsurprisingly, the one we're looking at here today, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which sold 400,000 units over the lifetime of the Game Gear. It was not a pack-in game, however. The Game Gear originally launched with a pack-in puzzle game called Columns, a match 3 puzzle game meant to emulate the Game Boy's own launch title, Tetris. Was it anywhere near as successful as Tetris? No, not even close. I think in total the Tetris version on Game Boy sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 33 million copies. It was an absolute juggernaut for the company. While the Game Gear was not flush with a huge number of peripherals and accessories, its most popular add-on device was arguably a TV tuner. What you did was you plugged it into the cartridge slot, and it allowed the handheld to receive over-the-air analog television signals, which for any of our younger viewers who don't understand what I'm talking about, back in the day... Now, this was obviously way before my time, but, you know, this is still how things used to be done, and technically you can still do it today. You actually received television signals by an antenna that was connected to the TV. Well, back in 92, 93, when this TV tuner was released, it allowed you to pick up those over-the-air TV signals. Technically today, yes, you can actually get HD television with a digital tuner, but I don't think most people watch TV that way. If they watch TV at all, it's usually through a cable package anymore. The TV tuner was not cheap. Total cost for it when it first came out was just over $100. The Game Gear also had a small number of converter unit models, collectively known as Master Gear converters, that allowed you to play Sega Master System cartridges on the Game Gear. Because of the Game Gear's smaller screen resolution, however, some games were more difficult to play, especially those with small text or bullet sprites. The unit was only compatible with cartridges, meaning that the Sega cards, which I had 2 of that we looked at as part of my collection, did not function with that adapter. The Game Gear sold a total of 10.62 million units over its lifetime, which is no mean feat in the Nintendo-dominated landscape of the early to mid-90s. The Game Gear unfortunately trounced those sales, and it wasn't even close. They cleared a massive 118.69 million Game Gear handhelds altogether, including all of the various versions, including the Play It Loud edition, which just had a clear outer shell so you could see the circuit boards and stuff inside, the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Light, and the Game Boy Color remodels. Official support for the Game Gear ended in 1997 worldwide. However, Majesco Entertainment received Sega's blessing to re-release a version of the handheld in 2001. Aside from a slight difference in the front face of the model, there were 3 ovals in the upper left-hand corner of the glass face of the Sega model, and those 3 ovals were red, green, and blue. On the Majesco model, all 3 of those ovals were white. In addition to that, the outer shell of the handheld was a darker shade of dark gray, and the labels on the back were made of a different material. I believe it was just paper. Aside from those differences, the Majesco unit looked identical to the Sega model. If you didn't know to look for those differences, you probably wouldn't know that it was not a Sega-produced handheld. Along with the new model, a single new Quotey Fingers game was released in the United States to promote that handheld. It was a port of the game Super Battle Tank, which came out in 1992. So you're talking about a game that was nearly 10 years old that they decided to put out for the Game Gear in 2001, 2002, whatever year it came out. So you're not talking about a handheld that came out... or a game rather, that came out anywhere near the original release and probably was nowhere near as graphically capable as the original version on Sega Genesis. I believe that game also came out on Super Nintendo, but obviously they probably ported the Sega Genesis version of it. So that's all the fun facts I had for the Game Gear. I do have a little bit of detail about my own experience with the handheld. I do remember the circumstance under which I received my Game Gear. My family decided one year to take a trip to visit family around Christmas time. We lived on the East Coast at that time. We all still live on the East Coast now. But we were traveling to North Dakota by car. We didn't do a whole lot of flying by plane back in the day. My parents are very frugal. We're very frugal in the day. And that trip from the East Coast to North Dakota is roughly 3 days by vehicle, or at least the way that we travel, it was 3 days. My parents decided that the best way to keep me and my sister occupied during that trip was to get each of us a handheld for Christmas that year. We did end up celebrating Christmas, I think, a week or two early, because we left for the holiday before the actual Christmas Day occurred, so we would be there on Christmas Day. And they decided to get us handhelds so that we could play them while we were traveling, so that's why we had to do Christmas early. I received the Game Gear for Christmas, and my sister received a Game Boy, the original model, the one with the green screen. I don't know why they decided to give us the two different handhelds that they gave us. I just know that that was how it ended up shaking out, is I got the Game Gear, she got the Game Boy. My Game Gear came with the game we're looking at today, Sonic 2. I don't believe it was a pack-in. I think that was just something you had to buy separate. In fact, I don't think I got the pack-in game columns. I don't remember ever having it. My sister got Tetris because that was a pack-in game with the original Game Boy, and a copy of Super Mario Land. Now, even though we were both given our own handhelds, I, rather bizarrely, received a copy of Metroid 2, Samus Returns, or The Return of Samus. I'm not sure which it was called back then, which is obviously a Game Boy game. It doesn't work on the Game Gear, meaning that we were expected to share our handhelds during the trip. How well did that work? I don't think it worked out all that well, because obviously with the battery hog that my Game Gear was, I probably died fairly early into the trip, and then my sister was left to play her handheld, and I had nothing to do. Because of the short lifespan of the batteries for the Game Gear, I did have to start using rechargeable batteries shortly after receiving it. If you know anything about the early history of rechargeable batteries, back in the early to mid-90s, they were nowhere near as reliable or fast-charging as modern lithium-ion batteries are today. What you're talking about is you'd get maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours of life out of the rechargeable batteries, and then you had to stick it on the charger for somewhere between 6 to 8 hours to get them fully recharged. So definitely not convenient or fast, but that was one of the only ways that I was able to play it, unless I used a car adapter, which my parents didn't get. They did have car adapters that you could plug into the cigarette lighter to power the handheld. Unfortunately, I never got that. I did, however, get the AC adapter that I don't know if it's sold with the Game Gear or if you had to buy it separate, but I did have it. But unfortunately, when you get one of those, it means you're tethered to a wall while you're playing the handheld, which kind of defeats the purpose of handhelds, but it is, after I kind of got tired of wrestling with rechargeable batteries, the way that I used it primarily was I just plugged it into the wall with an AC adapter. My Game Gear did get used for quite a while after I initially got it. Unfortunately, it met an untimely demise. I used to keep the handheld stashed in like a little Ziploc bag that I would sit next to a recliner in the living room while I was living with my parents. I had a nephew who used to be very hyper, I guess is a good way to put it, and he would actually get in the recliner that I would keep the handheld next to and rock it back and forth very aggressively. Unfortunately, the Game Gear fell underneath the recliner, and he started rocking up and down on top of it, and it broke the D-pad. So my Game Gear is no longer functional. Could it be fixed? Maybe. Is it worth it at this point? No, because as you can see, I can still play the games now because of backwards compatibility or retro consoles that allow you to play older games like we're seeing today. Thankfully, the games themselves are fairly durable. That was one of the big pluses for Nintendo's game cartridges, and I don't know if Sega had the same record of reliability, but I will simply say, for the most part, I think the Game Gear games that I still have are all functional. We might have one that's a little bit buggy, and I'm not sure if we're going to look at it or not. It depends on if I can get it to work. I won't say what it is to keep the surprise, but yeah, I know that at least one of them had a little bit of issue with functionality. So that's everything I had on the Game Gear. It was certainly a competitor to the Game Boy. I don't think it was a terribly successful one, and in fact, most handhelds were basically a pale shadow of the market dominance that the Game Boy had while it was still a Game Boy and didn't get upgraded to the Nintendo DS or whatever future versions, the Advance or anything like that. I don't have a ton to say about Sonic 2. I don't remember a lot about the game. Part of the reason for that, and I believe you'll see this if you watch the video while I'm rambling on here, is that the first area has a boss at the end of it that was pretty unfair. Frankly, it was a lot of difficulty, and even just watching back my playback here, I can say that a lot of the various patterns and tricks that I was trying to beat the boss match the way that I remember playing it when I was younger, which is the first thing I would try is just bouncing up and down on the enemy to see if I could damage it, which of course doesn't work. Bouncing on the enemy to try to trick my way past those little lead cannonball things that keep flying around on the screen. Trying to figure out the pattern of the balls when they come bouncing down the hill. And then, of course, the big F you at the very end when Dr. Robotnik comes swinging in at the very last second to kind of clip you before he runs into the area boss, whatever it is, an antlion or something. It was pretty garbage, and we'll mention that in the good, the bad, and the ugly. And in fact, we'll just go ahead and do the wrap-up for it now while the video is playing here. We'll go ahead and do the round of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is the game plays just like I remember a Sonic video game playing. Now, granted, my own experience with the Sega Genesis, and in particular Sonic games, is fairly limited. I didn't get any non-handheld Sonic games until probably the mid-2000s, and at that point it was part of a collection that I had on the PlayStation 2, which we will likely look at as a future episode of Nub's Collection. The game plays fast for a Game Gear title. It's certainly not the fastest game that I've ever played, certainly not the fastest Sonic game, but I think it's impressive for what it's doing, considering it is, again, on handheld. Now, of course, the caveat there is it's on a handheld that's basically powered by the same processor power as both the Sega Master System and the Sega Genesis, or at least a part of the Sega Genesis. So you would expect maybe it is capable of a little bit more speed, but as we'll go into in the bad, I don't know if that would have necessarily made for a very playable game. The game also gives you lots of unique paths that you can follow to complete each level. There is the ability to hit and destroy enemies by jumping up and into them instead of just landing on top, which is it's a hallmark of Sega, or Sonic games rather, and it helped differentiate this series from the obvious parallel at that time, which was Super Mario Brothers, where you had to land on top of enemies to kill them. You couldn't jump up into them. The only way that would work is if you were hitting a brick, which was underneath the enemy. The color palette is very well used in this game. Obviously, this is, depending on where we're at right now looking at the screen, it may not be the most obvious representation, but, you know, objects in the game, like the little egg that Dr. Robotnik uses to hold animals, is nicely detailed. Sonic has color gradation, which is nice. The backgrounds, the blocks in the background that have the kind of the checkerboard design look good. It's a good use of the color palette. Obviously, we're going to have some games in the future that may be even better, make better use of the color palette. But again, remember, this is a handheld, so graphical prowess is not necessarily expected with a handheld, at least not in the early 90s. Later and later versions of handhelds from different companies obviously will have better results. But I thought this was very well colored for this particular game and this time. As far as the bad, again, that first area boss is garbage. I think that the lasting memory I have of this game is I would get to the first area boss. I'd try, 4 or 5 times and fail every single one of them. And then I'd have to start the first area over. I'd get bored, and then I'd swap the game out with something else. I'm not 100% certain if I only had the one game for Game Gear when I originally received it, or if I did, in fact, get a second one. But I know that when I would play this, I would get really frustrated at how hard it was to get out of the first area, and I'd give up pretty quickly. Unfortunately, if you have a handheld and you only have the one game and you die as quickly as I was dying in this one, I probably got bored very quickly with this game. Frankly, the easy way to fix that would have been to swap the first boss that you face in this game with the one from the second or third area. Both of those, I think, if we see enough of the video to see the playback, I didn't have a whole lot of difficulty beating. They both had pretty easy patterns to figure out, and it took me 1 or 2 tries when I did actually get to them to actually beat them. Why they chose the first area boss that they did, I don't know. I think they probably could have found a better choice there. Unfortunately, it made the game so difficult it was prohibitive in that sense that I didn't play this one very much. I know I played a bunch of other games on my handheld or on my Game Gear more than this one. This one probably got very limited playback. The music, it wasn't very catchy in this game. I know that some of the early Sonic games had very memorable tracks. This particular one I don't think there were any earworm songs as part of this game. None of them that make me think of Sega, or not Sega, but Sonic in particular. I do think there is a certain cadence and choice in the songs that they use in Sega games that are pretty noticeable, that stick out when you hear them. Unfortunately, I don't think any of that quality is present in this particular game. The screen feels like it's zoomed in real close, like too close. Now, of course, if you get closer to the character models, you can see more detail, and this Sonic model looks very much like Sonic the Hedgehog, which is a strong plus, but it comes at the detriment of the available landscape on screen at one time. It feels very zoomed in, too zoomed in on the character. Not to mention, and I don't know how much of that has been visible as part of my playthrough of the game, when you're looking left or right, the screen has to shift to move more available real estate in front of Sonic, whichever way he's facing. And unfortunately, if you do that a lot in rapid succession, it makes the game very disorienting. Not to mention, it's more obvious not in the water levels, but yeah, if you do it on land, it moves very quickly and it can be very disorienting as a result. As far as the ugly, this game, unfortunately, because of how much it has going on at one time, does have a lot of frame rate drops, especially if you're rolling through some of the breakable barriers that you'll find throughout the game. They're distracting, but they're not game-breakingly bad. Also, collision detection when you're in the underwater area and you have to hop in one of the big bubbles to try to travel vertically. It's not very forgiving. If you clip the tiniest pixel of a corner against spikes or a wall, the bubble would seemingly pop, and it wouldn't feel like it was terribly fair in that sense. But other than that, not a whole lot that I thought was ugly about the game. I have to remind myself whenever I'm coming up with criticisms about this game and probably any future handheld games we're looking at. Again, they're handheld games, so they probably had a smaller development budget. They had to do a lot more work with a lot less processing power. There's a lot of things you have to take into consideration when you're rating a handheld game, because frankly, it wasn't as capable a system as the original systems that they were usually meant to supplement. So anyway, let's go ahead and do a score. We're going to do our score in Randars like we always do, 1 to 10. I'm going to give this game a 6. I think as a Sonic game, it's passable, but it just doesn't hold up to the experience you would get from a classic console Sonic game. So that, unfortunately, would have to affect the score. It plays fine. It's just not a great or memorable game. And boy, did they make a mistake making that first boss the one that they did, because it's too difficult. That should have been a late game boss, but unfortunately they chose the one that they did, and it affected my ability when I was younger to enjoy the game. The only way that I could get past that boss today and actually have a video to look at was I had to do a lot of save scumming. It's also part of the reason why I did all my vocal work today, or voice-over work today in post-production, because there would have been a whole lot of me cursing, getting upset at fighting this one boss over and over, and I didn't think it was going to make for good audio, so I said, we'll just do a voiceover and do some fun facts about the Game Gear instead. But yeah, this is a 6 out of 10. Not great. It's fine. If this was the only game you got for your Game Gear, I feel sorry for you, because I do think it's unfairly balanced early on, and it becomes a more playable and enjoyable game much later on, unfortunately. Too late to make it a great game. So, anyway, that's going to do it for this episode of Nubs Collection. As always, I do appreciate each of you watching, and I will see you next time.